people are expected to be, you know, showmen and, you know, full of confidence, and you know, I don't think I'm particularly like that. I think I'm, you know, quite unusual.
At this point, Depeche Mode has maintained itself as a household name since the 80s. From their breakout days as the kings of synthpop, to the dark works like Violator and Black Celebration that propelled them to the legendary status as both a mainstream radio act and gothic pioneers. It's safe to say that they're pretty accomplished at this point and have earned their place in music history. But like any long-standing band, there was a dark era, plagued with addictions, stress, and overall uncertainty of if there would even be a future for the project. And this is all chronicled on the album Songs of Faith and Devotion, Depeche Mode's 8th record, and follow-up to the magnum opus that was Violator, the record the band is still best known for today, and coincidentally, something that alone nearly caused the band to collapse. Because how do you follow up a masterpiece? What kind of tension would befall a person when confronted with topping their most well-known and adored work? In the case of Depeche Mode, it was addiction, clashing egos, insecurity, and a bit of an identity crisis. And by the end of this era, we might not have gotten the band's next best record, but what we did get was a dark, honest, and haunting album that serves as the band's most tumultuous output to date. So let's take a dive into the abyss and explore Depeche Mode's darkest hour. Let's take a look at Songs of Faith and Devotion.
Let's get together.
Hey, listen, you're on top of the pops. Alright, congratulations.
When we originally started, we had a bass guitar, rhythm guitar and synthesizer. Then we just gradually discarded our guitars for synthesizers. It was just a natural progression. We just liked the sound, it was good.
Come on everybody, won't you gather around? Listen what we're trying to say.
The name Depeche Mode comes from a French magazine called Depeche. Mode is just the word for fashion in French. Depeche Mode. And we just decided we liked the sound of that name. And we chopped off the accent and we just kept the pronunciation.
For those unaware of the band's history, Depeche Mode was a group that saw constant changes in its sound, taking a stab in different directions with nearly every release.
One advantage that you've had is that you've never been too associated with any particular musical trend, so therefore you don't go out of fashion when the fad does.
With their main staple being the darkening tone of their sound and aesthetics as the years would go on. First gaining prominence from their song Just Can't Get Enough.
We walk together, we're walking down the streets. I just can't get enough, I just can't get enough. Every time I think of you, I know we have to meet.
An overplayed piece of 80s cheese that honestly seems a bit funny in retrospect, considering just how deep into the darkness the band would go only a few years later. Where Depeche Mode would really find their niche, however, was in their albums Some Great Reward, Black Celebration, and Music for the Masses, as they each would see the band taking steps into more goth-adjacent territory, mainly post-punk and the at the time underground genre of industrial. Songs like People Are People,
Makes a man hates another man. Let me understand. We are people, so why should it be? You and I should get enough so awfully.
took some of the noisy production and grungy synth sounds found in artists like Skinny Puppy and Ministry, and presented it in a synth-pop context, creating a unique and infectious sound that tinged on the side of EBM while still being radio-friendly and mass-marketable. While, on the other hand, songs like Master and Servant continued on in this trend musically while also bringing in lyrical elements of BDSM, further catering to the goth and alternative market.
People think this is just food play, but it's more than that. I'm humiliating food to relish the power relationship I have with it. You like that, you little freak?
During the same era, the band would also cater to the other side of the alternative sound, with heavy elements of post-punk being included on the other tracks, like But Not Tonight.
Bring tears to my eyes, they're lighting my way tonight, and I haven't felt so alive.
As well as brooding ballads like Sometimes. It all went to set the band apart from the sleazy pop-oriented music that dominated the 80s. While all this catering to alternative markets and fusing the synth pop with other forms of music did well for the band, giving them a moderately high notoriety in the Western world, it would all pale in comparison to the explosion that they would see with their album Violator.
Not listening to advice and deciding in your youth on the policy of truth.
To cut it short, Violator was a cultural and commercial landmark and set the gold standard for what dark synth pop should be going forward, being home to songs like Personal Jesus, Policy of Truth, and The World Through My Eyes, that all still get regular radio play even 33 years later.
All I ever wanted, all I ever needed is here in my arms. Words are very honest.
It's safe to say that this was the album that turned Depeche Mode from a moderately successful 80s band to timeless superstars that would be written into the history books. But all the success and acclaim from both their pop songs and more underground work would propel the band onto a pedestal so big that there was really nowhere else to go but down. And that's not for any lack of skill or talent, but simply the result of hitting an extreme high. It's the same fate that has fallen thousands of other artists over the years, and one that often breaks those who it falls upon. In the case of Depeche Mode, after some successful tours and a good run of the record for a year, the project would cease production and go on a temporary hiatus.
As soon as we started working on it, it was obvious really that we were suffering somehow and that we weren't finding it easy to A, sort of come back together as a unit having had a bit of a break, and B, kind of live up to perhaps the success of Violator.
So this is the part where Depeche Mode rides off to the bank to cash out and half-ass a few more albums before eventually breaking up, only to reunite in the 2000s and be a legacy touring band, right? Not exactly. Probably the greatest bit of praise I can give Depeche Mode is that they aren't sellouts, where most artists, even when they hate each other, will simply cast it all to the side in order to grift as much cash from their fans as humanly possible.
Yeah, we're gonna need you to sign this waiver.
KISS assumes no liability for kids helped by KISS.
Although in the case of Depeche Mode, mainly its chief songwriter Martin Gore and singer David Gahan, the four-piece opted to take a 2-year break after the success of Violator.
It was the longest they'd been away from each other for, I suppose, 11 years.
And they didn't talk to each other all the time.
No, they weren't like phone buddies or anything.
In an attempt to salvage their working relationship and come back to make a follow-up record that wouldn't just act as a cash grab.
None of us came back with the idea that we were going to make Violator 2. Certainly not Flood.
The obvious thing, repeat Violator, let's not do that. Let's move it a step up again.
But things wouldn't exactly go as planned. While for the most part the band would go their separate ways and spend 2 years of their lives living out a relatively normal existence, David Gahan would opt to move to Los Angeles in order to be closer to the at the time up-and-coming grunge scene, most famously hanging around with Soundgarden and Jane's Addiction.
I'd moved to Los Angeles at that point and sort of been hanging out there on the strip with these new bands that were up and coming, like Jane's Addiction and stuff like that, that to me were really exciting, and I hadn't seen that or experienced that since I sort of went to see The Clash or something.
Upon returning to the studio to live out the few months with the band in order to write and record the next record, it became glaringly obvious that Gone picked up more than just inspiration from his grunge friends. The band would instantly be met with the elephant in the room once they reunited. David had become a completely different person, both physically and mentally. Now a skinny and disheveled heroin addict who stood in stark contrast from his former glory.
I've got to know him a lot better. I've liked him a lot more. I'd like to think he felt the same about me. And I feel, I don't know, in some way really close to his songs. When I was wanting something else, you know, he'd write that song. No, I really love singing Martin's. Martin's a brilliant songwriter.
He sounds decently coherent, but you can see by his overall demeanor and some of the sores and bruises that he was clearly using at the time. To add on to this, the rest of the band was no longer used to the more claustrophobic nature of constantly sharing space with one another, which quickly built tension, all topped with a cherry of stress that came with attempting to follow up their biggest record. The group moved into a house together and set up a studio.
We talked about how we could go about recording, and Flood had just come off the back of working with U2 on one of their albums. They put their own studio together in a property, in a building, and he thought that worked out quite well, so that we should try the same thing. So we did a bit of searching around, came up with this place, and we were all going to live there together and record together. It was going to be wonderful. Well, it didn't really work out that way.
During the writing process of the record, lead songwriter Martin Gore started developing an addiction of his own, slipping further and further into the bottle, while the mass amounts of pressure mounting on Gore's shoulders to write songs on the same level as Violator only furthered his need to cope.
Martin was the one who was feeling that pressure to make as successful a record as Violator.
Yeah, I mean, Andy's always got this thing, he always says that I work better under pressure, which I'm not so sure is true.
Obviously, this only made tensions amount further. One of the biggest issues faced during the pre-production of this thing was the lack of cohesion between each member and what they wanted the record to be. David Gahn insisted on pushing into a hard rock direction, and this lack of synergy would lead to a lot of frustration with little to no demos produced. And while keyboardist Fletch had done his best to keep peace and camaraderie between the group, it did little to quell the flames that were burning down the house. And once the band entered the studio to officially start recording the record, things only got worse.
As soon as we started working on it, it was obvious really that we were suffering somehow, and that we weren't finding it easy to A, sort of come back together as a unit having had a bit of a break, and B, kind of live up to perhaps the success of Violator.
Longtime collaborator and producer Flood was brought into the fold to not only record, but to help produce songs for the band during their time of hardship. Though this would be a much taller task than before, as the band had almost minimal pre-production this time around, which caused the first 4 weeks of tracking to end up being a waste of time with little to no usable recordings.
I remember the first 4 weeks was pretty much unusable.
I can remember me and Alan sitting in the airport in Madrid after the first batch, and our plane was like 4 hours late or something like that, and Alan go, let's get a beer, and then he toasted me and he said, here's to a complete fucking waste of time.
The lack of any real progress started to take its toll on the band and producer. In interviews, Flood described how the band would contribute as a unit in prior recordings. Obviously, they would still encounter disagreements and creative differences, but always would end up coming together to make the best choice for the music as a whole. But with the recording sessions of Songs of Faith and Devotion, each member of the group was extremely adamant about their own individual ideas, having a near toxic air of individuality, especially when it came to Gahn and Gore. This caused the tension to spiral out of control, something easily heard on the record itself, but we'll burn that bridge when we get there. While Gore subconsciously agreed with Gone about focusing less on the electronic elements of the sound,
everybody expects us to come out with a techno album, like sort of like a hard dance album. But I think there's so much of that music around at the moment, and the song's really getting lost. So I don't think I consciously sat down and tried to react against that. But I think it's just something that you do because, you listen to the radio, you go to clubs, and you're just sort of immersed in this same sort of music everywhere you go, that you go home. And for me, I think when I just sit down and write a song, it just comes out differently because I want to hear something different.
They didn't see eye to eye on the obvious grunge direction. If anything, what truly shows is Fletch's strong love of blues music. The album's guitars, songwriting, and overall direction felt far more influenced by blues than hard rock or even synth pop. Eventually, the recording sessions would cease for the record, and the band would take a very important break, something that helped keep them together when they were obviously on the verge of breaking up. However, upon returning to the studio, this time in a more traditional environment rather than a house, and went far more smoothly than the previous escapades. Though the overall damage was already done, Dave Gahan still struggled with his drug use, and the internal turmoil that was boiling over within the band had led composer and keyboardist Alan Wilder to accept that his run with Depeche Mode was over. While not immediately exiting the project, he would finish the record and subsequent tour before parting ways. And while the band was able to come out the other side with a critically and commercially acclaimed record that was met with high praise upon release, it did little to bring any real peace to the band, as Alan wouldn't be the only person leaving the group. Longtime collaborator and producer Flood would also vow to never work with the band again, and even dedicated member Fletch bowed out of the tour during the middle of it. Once the dust settled, it became very unclear if Depeche Mode would continue on, and for a few years that uncertainty laid within both Martin Gore and Fletch. It all really made it seem as if the story of Depeche Mode was at its ending point. Well, would you look at the time? It's the part of the video where I e-beg and I ask you to please check out and support my Patreon. Given that I don't compromise on the clips or the subject matter that I talk about on this channel, monetization and making those big YouTube bucks just is not really possible for me. So if you like what I do and you want to see more of it, Patreon is the best place to support me. If you would all enjoy the content or music or anything that I create, please consider supporting. I couldn't thank you enough. You have my gratitude. Now, to talk about the album itself, while it's a commercial and critical success to say the least, it isn't really for everyone. The album is as dark and drab as the story behind its creation. From the album's opening track, it's crystal clear that we're not going to be returning to the vibrant electronic sound of Violator. The song takes a far more industrial approach with its synths, contrasting with the blues rock sound of the vocals and guitars, with the chorus showing off the grunge influence previously stated. I feel you, your heart sings, I feel you, the joy it brings, where heaven waits, those golden gates, and back again. You take me to and lead me through oblivion. Even the lyrics on this song take a much darker and more personal tone than what has come before, with the sweet loving side being harshly contradicted by the idea of walking through oblivion. It's possible that this is a reference to how songwriter Martin Gore might have felt about the band at the time, or even his perception of Dave's addiction. The gloomy haze only continues on the album's second track, Walking in My Shoes, where we hear the band take on a tone similar to what could be found on early Nine Inch Nails releases.
Countless feasts laid at my feet, forbidden foods for me to eat. But I think your pulse would start to rush. Now I'm not looking for absolution. Forgiveness for
Morality would frown upon, decency looked down upon. The scapegoat fates made of me. But I promise now, my judge and jurors, my intentions couldn't have been purer, my case is easy to see. These lyrics need little to no explanation, as they clearly paint a picture of frustration, veiled in the sexual yet religious aesthetics that the band was famous for. It brings a visage of anger about how the lyricist feels about the way others see him, a theme that's continued on the next track, Condemnation. Condemnation, why? Because my duty was always to beauty, and that was my crime. Feel elation, high, to know I can trust this fix of injustice, time after time. Condemnation was a track actually meant for Martin to sing, but upon assistance from Dave, Gon would take the lead here, giving what he considers to be the best vocal performance he's ever done.
My sins, I show no repentance, I suffer with pride. If for honesty you want apologies, I don't sympathize. For kindness you substitute blindness. Please open your eyes.
And well, Dave's performance lives up to the praise he gives it, and it's easy to see why he connected with the song while being in the pit of his addiction. The enduring amount of emotion spewed through the music can be damn near tear-jerking at times, especially with the conviction in which Dave sings the song. And this track is also where the blues influence comes to a full head, with the blaring organs, southern influence chord progression, and Dave straining vocals during certain portions. While this might only be track 3, it is the pinnacle of the album. Not to say it's all downhill from here by any means, but the way this song perfectly captures the turmoil, pain, and emotion of the band during this era, it isn't something that can easily be matched. And that's something I think the band knew, as track 4 doesn't even try to compete with it. Rather, it's the most Violator influenced song off the record, with synths, vocals, and production very reminiscent of what was heard across that album. And the next track, Judas, follows suit in a similar path, though a bit more stripped down. It actually reminds me a bit of the softer songs heard on A Perfect Circle's 13th Step, and I wouldn't be surprised if it was an inspiration to them. It isn't until track 6, In Your Room, that the band returns to the more grungy industrial sound from the beginning of the record. Though it's one of the more underwhelming tracks off this album. It's by no means bad, but it does feel more like it's just a serviceable track. Although its lyrics continue the theme of suffering and condemnation that have been riddled through most of the album up to this point. I'm hanging on your words, living on your breath, feeling with your skin. Will I always be here? The anger really starts to show here, reflecting the frustration that was felt from the recording process. Something that has kind of bled its way throughout the entire album up to this point, and really makes it inseparable from the story behind how the music was made. Up next we have Get Right With Me, another more industrial tinged song that carries what are probably the most positive and hopeful lyrics on the record, speaking about finding one's path after being led astray and not letting uncertainty deter you from moving forward. Friends, if you've lost your way, you will find it again someday. Come down from your pedestals and open your mouths, that's all. Life is such a short thing that I cannot comprehend. But if this life were a bought thing, there are ways I know we'd mend. People, take my advice. Already told you once or twice. Don't waste your energy making apologies. It's honestly kind of ironic given the context of what was going on with the band, but given the contrast of the lyrics with the dark sound of the music, it's more than likely intentional. And with the ultimate outcome of survival of Depeche Mode, the song is almost prophetic in that way. Though this optimism is short-lived, as only a few songs later we're met with One Caress, a track tinged with pleads for divine forgiveness, but from a woman rather than Christ.
Just one caress from you and I'm blessed. And shine from the light. I've always loved the night.
The song tells the tale of apathy and possible sex addiction, where affection or sex are the only ways in which the lyricist finds comfort and meaning, a common coping mechanism that those who suffer from severe depression lead into. It's much easier to feel a lot less cold and alone when you're in the arms of another. The album comes to an end with Higher Love, sharing a similar sentiment to One Caress, but in a much more desperate and pleading sense here.
I surrender all control to the desire that consumes me whole, leads me by the hand to infinity, lies in wait at the heart of
I can taste more than feel. This burning inside is so real. I can almost lay my hands upon the warm glow that lingers on. Moved, lifted higher, moved, my soul's on fire, moved by a higher love. I surrender all control to the desire that consumes me whole and leads me by the hand to infinity that lies in wait at the heart of me. The track carries a far less sexual tone and rather sounds like genuine pleading with a higher power's help. With either addiction, apathy, or turmoil, you can kind of pick your poison and it will likely fit with the lyrics. It's a haunting and somber track with some of the best songwriting on the album. It's also a song where we can hear a bit more of Violator's influence, with the choices in synths and production, though David's vocals are much more strained and pained here. As I said, it's haunting and eerie and serves as a great closing track to what has been one of the band's darkest and most personal records to date. As previously stated, the album would see widespread acclaim and be seen as a knockout of the park. And given the turmoil and dysfunction that had plagued the band throughout this period, it was a miracle we even got a record at all, let alone one as great as this one. While it's far from perfect and might not be for everyone, as it can drag on from time to time and has little to none of the pop elements Depeche Mode was famous for, it's still a great piece and one worth listening to. The album would be supported with a massive tour upon release. While also a massive success, it did little to quell Dave's addiction, the growing tensions between the band as a whole, or change Alan Wilder's mind from departing the project. After the tour, the band would go dormant for a number of years, leaving the idea of any future for Depeche Mode up in the air, with many fans speculating that they would end up breaking up. And to their credit, even Martin Gore and Fletch would share in this disillusionment. Dave gone wouldn't get clean for years to come either, which was one of the key issues plaguing the band. It wasn't until 1997 that fans would be gifted with another record, Depeche Mode's 9th album, Ultra, and the future would start to seem more optimistic and clear for the band going forward. Eventually, Dave would get clean and the band would find relative peace, but even during Ultra, many of the tensions still remained, though it's these struggles and overall turmoil that can be thanked for inspiring much of the work and experimental directions that the band went during the 90s. Songs of Faith and Devotion is now looked at as another one of the band's best records and most defining moments, being bound to a dark and compelling story of a band pushing forward against all the odds to create something that could stand alongside an album as beloved and successful as Violator. And for that, I can say it's an album well worth the attention and one that deserves the acclaim it's been given. But with that being said, subscribe, support me on Patreon, follow me on Twitter and Odyssey. I'll see you in the next video.